So, welcome to the last in our series of apprenticeships events for National Payroll Week. Obviously, this is a delayed event because we were due to have it on the Friday of National Payroll Week, but that was the day after we got the sad news that the Queen had passed. And because this session is a fun and light-hearted session, it just felt all wrong in that first day after we'd heard the news and everyone was in a little bit of a state of shock. So we felt that it was the best decision would be to delay it until after the funeral. And so now we're here. Now we know that this week it does not work for a lot of people because it's pay run and pay cycle and whatever, but we are recording the session and it will be hosted on the NBKB website for anybody who wanted to join but wasn't able to. As you know, we do things a little differently here at NBKB, so you might have already gathered that from the title of today's session, Bumblebee versus Earthling in the world of payroll. What on earth is that all about and how does it have any relation to payroll? I'm Helen Hargreaves, Head of Payroll Policy here at NBKB, and I'm delighted to be joined by a good friend of mine, Karen Thompson, who's the UK Payroll Director at Anderson Brown. She's here to talk about the huge impact that technology has had on payroll in really a few really short years and what we can look forward to in the future. Now, Karen is at the moment suffering from really bad hay fever. She's taken her antihistamine. We hope that it's going to settle down very shortly. But in the meantime, just bear with her. This is going to be an interactive session. There's going to be points throughout it where Karen will be asking for your thoughts and observations. You can either add your comments to the chat box as we're going along, and I'll pick them out at the relevant times. Or when we get to one of the interactive parts where Karen would like your input, you can raise your hand using the team setting at the top of the screen and then join the debate. I need to tell you, I already mentioned earlier on, but I'm just going to stress it again, that this session's been recorded and is going to be hosted on our website. I'm just letting you know that in advance, just before you say anything that afterwards you think, oh, whoops. And with that, without any further ado, Karen, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Helen. Now, can everybody see that slide that's showing? Excellent. I just want to make sure with our technology. Thank you very much. And as Helen said, do forgive the somewhat bunged up approach to my voice. I'll do my best. I'm absolutely delighted to be here today, and I'm not going to make apologies for the title. When asked to speak about how payroll has changed over the years, it just seemed appropriate that for me as the little earthling, versus one of my favourite transformers, which is Bumblebee. So where am I starting from? Well, my career history, and again, I'm proud to say, is over 30 years in the payroll industry. But I did start as an office junior, actually up in Aberdeen, left school and off I went. Then decided that wasn't for me and became a dental nurse, so completely off the ball. And then, of course, into HR, pensions, that was through local government, and of course then payroll, starting off with Cumbria Police. And over that time, whilst I've always loved the Star Wars movies, E.T., for those of you who can go back that far to the 80s, when I watched those, they were so futuristic. In that world, it was that could never come to fruition. And that's because we didn't have the computers like we've got today. So for me, it was futuristic. So, when it comes to payroll, and I will cover some of this a little bit later on, but where we are now from where it was is nothing short of remarkable, as far as I'm concerned. I cannot believe how technology has moved. So let's have a look now at the agenda of what I'm going to be covering. But first of all, never-ending story. Join in, Helen, please. Reach the stars, fly a fantasy. I'll stop there. Now, for those of you who wonder what on earth that was all about, well, one, I love dancing, and two, that song was actually sung by Lamal in the 1980s. However, most of the people on this webinar today may recognise it. That is Dusty One, who reached out to his long-distance girlfriend Susie in, of course, episode 8 of Stranger Things. And why on earth have I chosen that? Well, for me, it shows that what's gone on in the 80s is now, although we, for me, it's like, oh my goodness, they're rejuvenating what was 80s is now. It just shows of all the things that, started then, how it's evolved to where we are now and how we are using things that we've learned in today's society. And that was just one thing. So I will be exploring where we've come from in a bit more detail and where we're going to. Now, for me, this slide just epitomises what it was really like. It was paper. For those who might remember, it was Kalamazoo sheets. And for those who don't have a clue what that is, they were great big sheets that you used to record for each employee any payments and deductions. And for those, the joy of using those was the blue pen and the red pen. Blue pen for payments, red pen for deductions. And then that information would be transferred onto punched sheets and all sorts of things. We didn't have email. There was no big payroll systems. You had big block phones, and in fact, they were dial phones, and you were really posh if you had a push button phone and a square one at that instead of round. But there were some positives back then with not having that technology, and that was client expectations or employee expectations were perhaps 14 days for a response rather than a minute behind you actually receiving the email of today. So we had typing pools, they were the norm. And again, if I go back to my reminiscing of the 80s, Dolly P and 9 to 5, that's how things were. And when I think of computers, I think of, one of my heroes, Wonder Woman. Wouldn't we all like to be there? And her computer system called Ira. But in reality, just even having a calculator back then that had the roll on it, so you could actually see and see if you've missed out when you're trying to reconcile a payroll or the cash payments that you were due to pay, was just an amazing thing. But interestingly,
story of my life, Karen, an adding machine where you punched it and pulled the lever down. Oh, I love that.
Absolutely. And you could look at it and say, all the overtime, look at that, it all adds up to exactly what's there. And these were the way in which it was done. But interestingly, there was in fact a very early payroll system that is supposedly reported to be the 1950s, and it was something called Leo. It's a Lions Electronic Office, and this was sort of designed, and again, only massive companies that had big budgets could use something like this. But it was to try and get rid of what they called clerical tasks, and payroll was viewed as just one of those things, clerical tasks. So that was, that was around, but say huge big companies there. And it wasn't really until the 90s that payroll systems as we know it today, not quite as we know it today, that started. And one of the first ones that I remember was Rutherford Webb, the black and green text, and a system called Open Door. Some others at AAB who've been in payroll as long as I have as well remember something called TOMS. So I don't know, what do people on this call remember? What was your first ever system that you recall? And I bet you it's going to be one of these modern day ones.
Mine was called FlexiPay. Definitely wasn't modern. Didn't do anything.
FlexiPay, so there's one.
Mine was an internal IBM one, and I can't remember for the life of me what it was called.
But nothing like the ones of today then.
Oh no, definitely not. And you had a payroll report that came out on that paper with the little holes down the side. And it was just reams and reams and reams of paper. You had to check everybody individually. And I can't remember what it was called though, but it was an internal IBM system that they'd created themselves.
And the first time
but doesn't it make you smile?
The first time that I did payroll was while I still worked at the revenue, but I was doing the payroll for the Accounts Office Play Scheme, which was a business in its own right. And I wasn't allowed to use payroll software in case it corrupted any of the systems. So I still had to do everything manually using tables, a calculator, and the only technology I was allowed was an Excel spreadsheet.
Wow. Okay, I think we're ahead of the game there from Helen, don't you think?
Yep. And that was very late 90s, early 2000s, that was actually.
Wow. Well, that just leads me to think then, what has made technology make such leaps? And where I'm saying technology, I am talking about the world of payroll and even to point HR, rather than, technology that is massive around the world now. But not just what made the leap, but, what allowed companies to make investment in that, whether it was the companies that were creating software or whether it was the companies that were buying software. Well, this next slide might just have something to do with that. I remember starting when you're looking at your old manual records of Kalamazoo and those print sheets, you used to get a little box from what was then Inland Revenue and the Contributions Agency. And in that box were cards that showed you what you do with a tax code, what you do with national insurance and so forth. And that's what you always had one of these every year. And then HMRC, as it became, moved to manuals that again were print, and now look at where we are today. But if we look at this slide, I mean, these are just some key events. I mean, there's over 170 pieces of legislation that impact payroll. But these are just some of the key ones, from the government, I think, very quickly realised there could be quids in here by employers, therefore payroll, operating some of the things that they did. And of course, one of the first and earliest ones was statutory sick pay. I mean, obviously, pay as you earn goes before that. But, and we've moved on to the family related legislation. And then you've got your data protection side of things. And then it was a case of how can we talk to HMRC in a more efficient way for them, and obviously for the DWP around universal credits, and RTI was born, and then it was state pensions are costing an awful lot of money. How can we encourage people to save for pensions? Let's bring in automatic enrolment. And all of these things, you've been through this journey as well. But that's what makes me wonder, I remember the green sheets for SSP, and you had you put your Q and your W and your P in for your qualifying and waiting and payment days and so forth, which is a way really that payroll software almost mirrors in it, but in a different way. So I just wonder now, I think legislation definitely must have had a big part to play into why people thought, okay, this payroll thing that used to be known as this clerical duty is actually getting a bit of legs. And I think that for me, that's my personal view. I think that was one of the biggest reasons for technology. And indeed, those investors like Rutherford Webb and others, of course, so doing that. And of course, what we find is the more legislation we have, if there's legislation that impacts an employee, it's going to impact payroll. And that's why HR and payroll, I think the synergy and how we're working more and more together is absolutely crucial, because what impacts them normally impacts us, maybe differently, but nevertheless an impact. I mean, if we look here, one of the things that makes me smile, and I know this is a swear word, and it's not a real swear word, Helen, don't worry, but it's that word that begins with F and ends in OUGH, that we're not allowed to say, and something called the JRS. But when we think about that, it's a case of, the payroll industry absolutely came at me. And yet our technology on the whole, other than spreadsheets, just was not there to support us. So I don't think we're there yet. But what was interesting was how this came out. And because that little word or words are called reference pay, all of a sudden, nobody knew where this was going to sit within an organisation. And what I've come to realise, talking to different clients in particular, because obviously I'm a service provider, is that where they don't know where it fits in an organisation, it must be payroll. Seems to be the flow. And of course, that was absolutely true of the pandemic and the various schemes that came out of that. Now, don't get me wrong. whilst we all were put under probably a huge amount of pressure, some maybe pressure we've not felt before, we did an amazing job, and we made sure that the people were paid, and not just here in the UK, throughout the world. Most countries had something of that ilk, so something to be proud of. And okay, we used spreadsheets on the whole for it, but nevertheless we managed to use some form of technology to help support us. But then, of course, we look at technology as a whole, that for me, it is advancing even now at a rate of knots. We've gone from paper and old things to then what we know now, bear with me, of computers, mobile phones, 365. I mean, who would have thought that Microsoft, and I remember that first computer and the as you dialed it up, and it took forever long, and you had all these floppy disks to load in to get the software for what was Microsoft being born in the home. And now, of course, everything's in the cloud, subscriptions appear. But then we think, the future again, we've got electric cars, but not only that, driverless cars. Now, there's a reason insurance companies have not approved these driverless cars and being run by robotics. And that is because a computer cannot make a decision on whether it should hit the cyclist or hit the pedestrian. And that's, I'm putting this quite crudely. And that is because it requires a human. And there is never going to be a computer, in my view, that could ever make that decision. What algorithm could you put in that says, yeah, that life doesn't mean anything more than that life? It's not going to happen. And this is how I think about technology that can help payroll, in the fact that we shouldn't be afraid of it, because there will always be a reason that you need the human being. But like these driverless cars, if you were, it can do the accelerator. It can change your gears. I mean, automatic cars do that now. It can know the distance between you and the car in front. But ultimately, it can steer your car, it can park your car, it can do all those things. But it needs, so if we look at it in a similar way, what can we use technology for? So we're not replacing us with technology, quite the opposite. We want the bot to do what we don't want to do, which is pressing those buttons. So we can embrace it. Now, we've got cloud-based software now, instead of, I don't know if you remember the rooms that would be locked, and certainly Helen, I'm sure at the Revenue, there were plenty of rooms, and there probably still are, with all those machines that look like Ira from Wonder Woman. But cloud-based software. Now, there are a number of software providers that will argue something that says it's cloud-based isn't really cloud-based. I'm not going to get into that debate. I haven't got enough knowledge on that part of it as to what it is. But the main thing is there is some sophisticated software that is out there that's maybe not in the cloud. And some of them I'm using, I'm not going to start plugging names on this webinar, but they are old and antiquated in the way in which they were built, but they're still very, very sophisticated, especially for bureau. Whereas you've got some new kids on the block that are more whizzy, but at the end of the day, if you've got these older pieces of kit that are still fantastic and they are still being developed, and they're not in the cloud, you have to ask yourself, there must be some difficulty in just replicating into the cloud. Otherwise, they'd have all done it by now. And then we look at other things like 365 or Teams. I mean, who would have thought? I certainly know at my previous employer, Armstrong Watson, which is where I was in the pandemic, that they were all introducing Teams, and they thought, oh, it's going to be a bit difficult to get people off the phones and introduce the headsets and this, that, And of course, in one weekend, the world changed, and all of a sudden, Teams was now a thing of the norm. We couldn't be doing this now if it wasn't for Teams. It would be a live event that would be costly and everything else. And this is there are absolutely reasons for face-to-face, and we all hope to be attending some of these bigger events in the future. But with accountancy firms who are also bureau, timesheets is a big thing. And all of a sudden, you can get technology now that will do this and then it will link to this, and it will link to this. And what it's doing is it's not replacing all the manual tasks, but it's aiding the manual tasks. So one of the things is if you could have a Teams call, and it will say, right, we've recognised you're on a Teams call. Tell us who the client was. And you put the client number in. That robotics will remember who that client was in the future. And all of a sudden, that drives to a timesheet. That goes into the client folder that says you've had a telephone call and all these things. And that is all possible because of bots and technology. So at the end of the day, when you're emailing, you're doing things, it's a case of, okay, is there a way? As a bureau, one of the most frustrating things, and for anybody who is listening to this or indeed on this webinar, you will know how frustrating it is, albeit it doesn't make any sense as to why you need to do this, when you're chasing a client for their payroll data. Now, one would think they want their people paid. So why we have to go chasing them all the time? But this is where technology can come in, because if you're using some form of workflow system that enables it to link to, say, your Outlook account, and it links to the client, then you're not chasing them. You need to have something like, in place, but you will then be able to get the robot to send out these reminder emails. Just an example. So again, not replacing you, it's just saving you doing a job that you don't want to be doing. The more of we think about today, mobile phones for employees, this is where things are going. I speak to my nieces and nephews, and they don't, okay, they have a laptop for school, but they do everything on their phone. They don't have a printer. Who has a printer these days? And okay, yes, I do, because I'm of that age. And yeah, I can see that Helen has a printer. Do you have printers who are on the call?
Yeah, I've got one at home and one at work.
No. I'm allergic
there
to
we
paper.
go.
If
so
someone starts
right.
printing something off in our office, I'm like, what are you printing and why?
Now that's very, very interesting. So I do have a printer. I mainly use it for something, for photographs or something like that, to be fair. I have changed. And as far as work goes, I don't print anything off because I don't think it's appropriate to be printing on our, on a home computer, on a home printer. Now, my husband, however, who does budgets and everything else on Excel, it's all saved in the cloud, and I don't know how many backups it's there, we'll still print it and put it into a folder. So I still have some educating to do. But I think you're right. It just shows that where you have a printer, you do tend to print. When you don't have a printer, like yourself, who's allergic to paper, you don't. I mean, that was one thing, wasn't it? The pandemic, for those who still produce paper pay slips, that went because you couldn't. So, in that case, the pandemic did do us some good. And I am with you. I'm not quite allergic to paper, but I'm almost there. So if I can get away with not having paper, I will. I now don't download train tickets, for example. They are in what you now have called a wallet. Who knew? I have a business card that is actually a physical card with a QR code on the back. I don't hand out business cards anymore, because it goes straight into somebody's phone. So technology, especially with phones. I mean, I remember saying the other day about a watch, and I said, yeah, mine tells the time. Now, actually, it is a smartwatch thing that will do all sorts of other whizzy things, but actually I use it to tell the time. There are still people who use a phone purely to make a phone call. If you speak to the younger generation, what's a phone call? It's either TikTok or it's text. In fact, I don't even think it's text anymore. I think it's WhatsApps and FaceTimes and all of those things that they use now. So the way of the world is changing, and we do have to change with it. But how might we start to look at that, which is one of the more serious points? I know I gave it a sort of a techie title, but the truth of all this is really this part of it, and it can sometimes feel a bit like Now, that again is from Stranger Things, but it also is, of course, the fantastic Kate Bush from the 80s. But part of this is, what is it? How can we get to technology? And more importantly, even if obviously if you're on board, you're allergic to paper, you are most probably likely to be on board. Absolutely. And I'll come back to you in after this bit. But how do we bring people along? How do we persuade, in this change curve, because it is a big change curve, because payroll professionals on the whole, and myself included, have been used to being back office or go way, way, way back to those 50s of viewed as clerical, and we're not. And I think the pandemic showed just what resilience we have, and indeed our knowledge and our transferable skills, right across the board, because we had to do communications. Most people were learning to do webinars. Most people were learning to write blogs. All of these things suddenly happened in the world of payroll. Aside from the fact of you picked up your thin client and your great big screen and took it off home for those who didn't have laptops. Now, I'd be very surprised if people don't have laptops now, but this was done. So there is a big change happening, and I think it will, for me, I think it will be quite quick. So what are the kind of things that I think we need to think about, or certainly what I've been putting into strategies? And I think the first part is you look at your process as a whole. And I do mean warts and all here, not in a way of criticising, blaming, because that's how it's always been done, or anything like that. Actually take a real objective view, step back and say, what is it we do? And you can break it down into bite-sized chunks even. If you think of, if you have a checklist or a procedure now that you run through for every payroll, look at that in detail. And then say to yourself, right, which bit needs the human, genuinely needs the human, and which bit could be a bot? And I'm not suggesting for one moment that we all turn into IT experts, because that we will not. There are people out there who are IT experts. We are payroll experts, and that's what we do. And so effectively, if we just use something quite simple, like a scale of 1 to 10, and you've got 10 processes, one could be getting the data from the client or from the employees through your HR or what have you. The other could be the final bit of your RTI submission, pension uploads, for example. And outputs. So if you can look at that, you think, okay, how do I get the data in from the client? And you say, okay, it comes in on email and it's all scatty and it's handwritten. The first thing you know is, right, a bot can't read that, because a bot can't read that because it's not a human. A human can read that. A bot can work with procedures, algorithms, and data that is in a particular format. So your first thing you think, right, okay, well, that's one of my first obstacles in the fact of how we get our data. I'm not saying you solve it now, you just recognise that. And you go all the way through your process. And this is what I've done. And I'm doing now as well. And you look at this and you say, right, okay, where can we get a bot? And what I determined was, well, actually, if you can get the bot to import the data, how do we get that to do that? IT can sort out the actual how, but what will enable me to take advantage of tech to do that? And one of the things that I looked at was, okay, we don't have timetables for our clients. So actually, whilst we know they send it in around the 23rd, they don't actually know when it's due in, and neither would a bot. So how could it send that chasing email, for example, we've not got your data yet, if it doesn't have a date to start with? So that's one of the things you think, okay, everybody needs a timetable, right? That's an education piece, because don't get me wrong, this will not happen overnight. And I think anybody listening to this knows and thinks either Karen's got rose-tinted glasses on, or thank goodness she's just said what she said. Because it will not happen overnight. It is very much education to make things to change. So you get these things in place. So whatever your obstacles are, to allow a bot to do something, that's one of your first things that you need to start changing. In the meantime, of course, you're talking to your tech teams, whether they're internal or outsourced. You talk to your tech teams. And what I've done and what I've found has worked is, don't try and find the solution or think you know the solution from an IT perspective, because the odds are on you won't. You know what you want it to do. You don't necessarily know how it's going to do it. Now, some of you may have that experience, but I don't. I leave IT to IT. And I went along and said, right, I would like to achieve that when the data comes in, and this is now on the assumption it's in an input format, It's on time, what have you. When that data comes in, what do I need to do with it? And the first thing I might do is sense check it. Are there comments that the human needs to deal with first? Or if it's a client or the way your payroll works, could the bot do a validation or whatever it is? It depends on what your data is and how that comes in. Once that's happened, it's a case of, right, that needs imported into the payroll software. Now, at the moment, it's like to be a human that takes that file and does what it needs to do to get it into the payroll software. Well, why couldn't a bot do that? And if there's no validation errors, let's call it, the bot knows that that's come in now. It knows what clients that's for or what payroll that you're running it's for, and in it goes. And then, of course, it says, actually, there's no errors on this. It's all gone through. There's no employees that are missing. There's no leave, whatever it might be, whatever your rules are, shall we say. And it says, right, OK, I'm now going to go to the revenue and I'm going to pull all the tax codes down. And some of you may do this already, but you actually might press the button to make that happen. Well, why not let the bot press the button? Down they all come. And again, it validates and says, yep, I've got all these tax codes. There's nothing untoward here. Let's run with that. And then it goes off to, it says, right, this client has it authorized. So the bot then says, there you go, the client. I've put it into this secure portal, whatever that might be, because we're not doing email now. And can you press this button to authorize it? Authorize it, comes back, the bot says, oh, fantastic, that's all done, there's no problems at all. And it then can, in theory, go off to do the RT or do the backs, get the hashtag, send it off to your backs provider. It can send the RTI submission, and then it can produce the pension upload. Now, of course, we all know with pension uploads, there are some that you can automate and some that you can't. So again, there may be some things. But I suppose where I'm going here is, the bit that needs our knowledge and our skills, and we have a lot of them, is where you're looking at that data, doing those sense checks, looking and thinking, do you know, as an employer, why don't I ask our HR, could they look at doing X? Because I think that would be more efficient. Or if it's a client, do you know, they're doing such and such. I've noticed here all their pensions and nobody's salary sacrifice. That's actually, I wonder if I could have a chat with them about that and just see, is it something that they've ever considered, and do they need some help with looking at that? That advisory role where you add that extra value, because our clients, where you are a service provider, expect you to get their payroll right, accurate and on time. Your employees, if you're an employer, expect their payroll to be right and on time. So that's already a given. So what more can we do that we're going to enjoy? Because that's using our knowledge, that's using our expertise. And let's face it, we like to help. We like to feel like we're making a difference, but we cannot. If you look at everything we do, from RTA to pensions to checking data to constantly having to try and read an email, get a piece of paper and say, is that account number X, Y, Z, and having to phone the client or check with the employee, is this, that and the other. If we get rid of all that, then we can concentrate on the stuff that we want to do. And I'd be very interested, before coming towards the close of this webinar, on your views on that. Is that somewhere, am I completely bonkers? Or do we think together as a profession that this is something that we should be striving to achieve? Over to yourselves. Any comments?
I know that there will be comments. I can see someone's just turned their microphone on then. So go on, Jen.
Yeah, I think it's just difficult. I don't know. I think it's difficult, isn't it? I work in a bureau, so trying to automate things is exceptionally difficult because nobody sends everything the same way, and you'll know, you ask clients to do things and sometimes they're just like, yeah, we don't want to.
Yeah. Are you in
there's nothing you
a
can do
bureau?
about it.
Yeah. Are you in a bureau that's pure payroll, or are you in a bureau that's part of like an accountancy firm?
One that's part of an accountancy.
Right. So you
they're
have my
even more
sympathy.
special.
we are very special. And I understand where you're coming from, in that, because historically, if we think of and this is just a different way of, and as I said, that's why I'm not looking at rose-tinted glasses that this can happen overnight, because it cannot. But if we, historically, it would be a case of the payroll within an accounts firm would have been back office. It might not even have been a payroll professional that was even doing it. And let's face it, back then it was much simpler than it is of the last 10 years, and particularly of today. So when you're looking at that, it was the RMs, as we like to call them, for those who's not in an accounting, this would be maybe their client relationship manager, which could be their accountant or their tax advisor, ordinarily. And payroll would be part of, normally, a package. Now, we do have what we call payroll-only clients, but on the whole, they would be part of the practice. And because they look after a portfolio of clients, it's much easier to tailor to the client needs. When you become the payroll and you want to make changes such as this that do make us efficient and will indeed bring much more profitability to the accountancy practice, it is more difficult because we have to standardise to a degree. And I think this is where, Jennifer, it is one of the issues, isn't it? Is that everything's been so used to being tailored and clients getting to this way of, I can do it my way. And you're now saying, but actually, we need to standardise so that we can be more efficient. We can do this, we can do that. And it's finding the benefit to the client in particular to persuade them that this is a good thing to do. And indeed, our colleagues quite often. Is that sort of where you're coming from in the fact that these are some of the challenges that you face before you even start looking at your processes?
I think so, yeah. I mean, some clients they've like, well, I've done my payroll this way for 20 years and it suits me. You know, I used to have a client that literally, not at this firm, at a previous firm, who would he would just sporadically throughout the month think of like, I need to pay James 5 hours overtime. And he'd write it on a post-it. And then he'd have this stack of post-its and he'd just come and drop his post-its off in the office. And he'd never change. I was like, he had a computer, he could email because he would receive his reports by email. He didn't have paper pay slips, but it was like this one, he was like, no, I have to do it that way. I was like, why? And I was like, send me an email instead. Like, it's fine, I'll receive 15 emails. I would prefer not to, but we don't mind. And he's like, no, I have to. And he'd drive into the centre of Manchester and drop his post-its off. And then I'd have to arrange them on the photocopier so that I could scan them in so that people knew what we'd done. It was like, I don't know. But some of them are just, I'd love for everybody to send it in the same way. And then no matter who picks it up, everybody knows what the information means. But I think it's a people thing, I think. And I think the automating processes that involve people in organisations is one of the hardest things.
And Jen, I think you've hit the nail on the head there, because you're talking about bureaus and relationships with your clients, but the same problems can occur within a business if you're an in-house payroll. Karen, you talked about the relationship between HR and suggesting to HR that they do something which makes everything smoother for payroll. I know of some businesses. I know some businesses where the relationship between HR and payroll is marvellous, but I also know the relationship where HR do exactly what they like, what's best for HR, without necessarily considering payroll. They've even brought in an a software system for HR, regardless of the fact that the payroll people couldn't work it. So when the information went across to payroll, it all had to be done manually. So how can that relationship, how can that be the company being able to see that wider benefits for the business rather than looking at them siloed, that they work together? You know, if there are any people on this webinar now or listening to the webinar where they are in that situation where they need to encourage that, recognizing the benefits wider, whether it's for clients or whether it's for internal customers and colleagues, how can they go about that? Have you got any advice?
From my perspective, I think if we start with the bureau particularly and clients, the first thing you can do is carry out the exercise of what you need to do and how you can do it. Because what you can do is any new clients, you can say, this is how we work. So that's your first thing, is you can absolutely say to new clients, and most businesses will, if they want to join you, say, this is how we do it. The other, of course, there are other ways, obviously educating and saying to them, when you do this, it means it can go in and we could get your payroll back to you within X time. So if that's possible. So it could be if the client likes their payroll, back to them before you've even received it, maybe that's something that would be of benefit to them. If they have a lot of amendments and it creates errors, which naturally it can do if you're constantly getting sticky notes, goodness me, or even multiple emails instead of being on an input sheet, or multiple input sheets coming through, by saying to the client, look, if we could do it like this, we're going to reduce the errors. What that means is when it comes back to you for authorising it, it will be correct. So it's just a case of understanding, and this is with each client what that can mean. Now, when it comes to working with internal departments, now at AAB we actually do that, because quite often some of the really large businesses, because obviously AAB started with oil and gas, so some of the very large businesses, they have HR systems, what have you. Fortunately, and I know this will not apply to everybody, so I fully understand that, is we try and look to integrate with their HR system. That is another option. Now, that will depend on, does the client, where it's client, have an HR system, or indeed internally? If you've got two separate systems, because I am sort of swaying towards, is there currently one system that is an absolutely super duper payroll and a super duper HR? I don't think there is. That's my personal view. That's not to say there isn't one. I just haven't personally. But there are some super duper HR systems and some really super duper payroll. And the idea really you want is to get them to talk to each other. Now, that is possible, particularly where there's software that has these things called open APIs. I know that that's just a way of computers doing this. Don't ask me how it does it, it just does. And I know here at AAB, some of those very large employers, it will look to integrate with some of that. Now, these are most likely major HR software providers as well, I might add. But they will look where it's a large client with lots of things to say, right, let's look at some integration. So that data is coming directly from there and into payroll. So that's another thing to look at, if it is within your gift, of course, and I accept it won't be within all accountancy practices. I understand that, because it requires IT expertise. But there are things. Internally, it is a case of sitting down and communicating. Payroll, and I include myself here, we are very good at we get on with it and we find solutions, even when it's difficult. We don't tell anybody that it's difficult. We might twine and whine in amongst ourselves, saying, doing this, and I'm sure everybody recognises that face. But we don't actually share that with our colleagues. We don't say, look, what you're actually asking us to do involves X, Y, and Z. And this is actually really quite difficult for us. We're going to have to find a way of doing X, Y, and Z. And one of the classics that's out there at the moment that's suddenly taken off is holiday pay. That's another couple of swear words, I think, at the moment, in the fact that all of a sudden it's a case of payroll should be calculating holiday pay. Well, why? That is very much an HR, but because it's hard, and I'm not saying HR don't do hard things, please don't don't misquote me there. It is hard in the fact that you've got to look back 52 weeks. You've also got to know, was there no pay in one of those weeks, and go back a bit further. And this is constant. And it depends on when they take their holiday as to how far you go back, and all of these things. And there's a reason it's not in payroll software. It's because it's not payroll. It is, in fact, employment law. It belongs in a different space. But of course, payroll being payroll will say, oh, well, we'll see what we can do. But actually, it's a very difficult thing for us to do, because we don't have all that data. We've got pay. We may not know whether overtime was enhanced. The client may have decided, or your employer may decide that it's all overtime. Coming across another one that says, oh yeah, but they have to go offshore, or they go on this and they get an enhanced payment for that. We want that included. So it's T's, it's terms and conditions, T's and C's. So that definitely does sit with HR to make those decisions of what it should be. But because there's a lot of confusion, this has just come out of this Brazil case, which was actually about holiday entitlement rather than pay itself, but obviously had a result on pay. All of a sudden, lots of these are coming out the woodwork saying, well, I think payroll, and particularly, sorry there for those of you in bureau, an accountancy bureau, a client expectation does seem to be that payroll will do that. And it's managing that. So if you're talking internally to your HR colleagues, it's explaining to them, actually, we don't have a way of doing that within our software. But the odds are on HR software might. Not for the actual payment, but it should be able to pull what hours or whatever else. So it's, for me, my strongest advice is you educate the clients, you push back on clients, or you say, for those in bureau, well, okay, I will have a look at this, but it will be at a charge. Don't do it for nothing. And I know that that's difficult particularly for payroll, but we're very valuable. We're very skilled at what we do. And, if you take one of your accountancy colleagues or tax colleagues, they don't do pro bono for anything that's out of the norm. They charge for it. And we need to do the same. From the in-house perspective, it is a case of just sitting down with your colleagues and say, look, let's work at this together. And by showing your colleagues what you're trying to achieve and how, they will then see the difficulty in what you're trying to do. And perhaps together you will come up with a workable solution that is workable for both of you. And of course, ultimately, your employees, where you're in-house. Accountancy of persuading to support you in what you're trying to achieve with clients. Again, little roadshows, team webinars, all things like that. But ultimately for the accountancy firms, I'm afraid to say it's going to be numbers. So you show the partners, and of course I was a partner at Armstrong Watson. You show the partners and you say, if I do this, this is the profit that you will make. That normally at least piques interest. To deliver it. So that's another piece of advice. For in-house, it's the fact that the overtime bill might reduce. The business is increasing the number of employees, and by historically that means you need to recruit an extra person. Perhaps with some efficiencies you don't. So again, you'll normally find with your FDs of the world in-house, it'll be numbers. With your HR colleagues, it's making both of your lives easier. I think I'm trying to put that as politely as I can. That's for me where it would be. Well, that's how I would approach it. I don't know if you have a different view, Helen.
No, especially when you were focusing on the communication, I think that is a massive thing, really. And in-house, showing the benefits, showing the reasons why, if you're all working the same way, then there has to be benefits to the business, cost benefits and time benefits. And to be honest, sometimes time is much more valuable than the cost. And looking at the payroll bureaus, it's not that long ago that people would turn up with all the paperwork in a carrier bag, and you would think that they would never ever move on from that, but they have. We're not completely cloud-based or whatever, but there is that move, and it will continue, and eventually you will get everybody, whether they're cooking and screaming or what, you will get that move across for them to do it as you would like them to, even if it's because you're hitting them in the wallet if they don't.
I mean, would you agree, for anybody on the call? Any comments would you take a different approach? Do you agree with that thought process that I've shared?
Yeah, I'm currently trying to get a new time and attendance system so that it speaks to payroll. And we were on ADP Freedom, which just about did the payroll. And we've been upgraded So what I'm now hoping is that we can bring in another ADP portal purely for time and attendance, because at the moment I get the overtime in 2 different formats that I then collate and enter manually into the payroll. Thankfully, the HR manager at the site I'm on is on board, and she's been involved in a lot of the discussions, and she's going to take it to the senior management team. So it's kind of convincing them, because it will push back a lot on the middle management, so that the team leaders or the supervisors are approving the team's overtime. And I think that's where we're going to have an issue, because they're actually going to have to do the work rather than us going down and asking them, oh, is this okay? They're actually going to have to sit and tick a box to say, yes, it's been approved. So it seems that HR is on board with me. It's going to be more convincing middle management that they actually have to do what they're essentially paid for. They should be approving overtime and sickness and holidays, and a lot of the time they just leave it to HR.
So that's one of the things, isn't it? You're looking for people to be accountable. And too often, if you've got an employee where something is not right with the hours that have been recorded for whatever reason, because obviously we don't like the blame game, and it seems to be either we take the blame or it means we have to pass blame to a colleague, and neither really is acceptable. What you want is the employee to be paid accurately. And I suppose that's maybe one of your persuasion arguments is, well, hopefully your HR colleague, maybe with yourself, says to the business, look, here's some of the experiences. This is what's been happening. You have an unrest with employees. Now, I don't know what your business recruitment retention rate is like, but we all know about the great resignation, this, that, and the other. And it could be, you say, look, the one thing that can demotivate our employees is not having their pay correct. Well, by passing this to middle management, who are then accountable for that individual, they're going to know if that is right or not. Whereas you in payroll take a number and you pay it. And maybe that's a persuasive argument that you're trying to give better employee satisfaction, which if you do have a retention issue could aid, or if you do have a recruitment issue, by making sure that what people work and they get paid accurately for is of a benefit. I don't know, you may have other good arguments for your HR person to put forward as well. But I think that's what I would be doing is I suppose in a way I'd be saying, you middle managers are so important. You've got so much accountability, and it's important that you look after your teams, and therefore we think this responsibility should sit with you. And there's just a way of maybe doing that to persuade them. But I wish you all the very best in getting that through, because that does seem a very sensible and automated approach. The difficulty will potentially be that all goes through, and of course your middle manager does sign off and it goes through the payroll, is perhaps in advance think about how you might deal with that so that you don't go down the blame game. It's one of the reasons most bureau do not deal directly with the employees, is because you're either having to blame the employer or yourselves. So it's either you, certainly obviously if it's our doing, it's our doing, but you don't want to be blaming your client in front of the employee. So in this case, maybe think about that ahead of it, that if that all goes through, what will you do in if there is a mistake made by that middle manager that impacts the employee, so that you can manage it, as amicably, shall we say, as possible. How are we doing for time?
We have 3 minutes left.
Oh, okay. My first thing then is, does anybody have any questions or anything you would like to discuss with me? Okay. Well, if you would like to afterwards, thank you. If you do have anything in the future, obviously you can contact Helen, my contact details, or I'm on LinkedIn, it's Thompson without a P. Feel free, which leaves me to say thank you. But for those of you who are intrigued, does anybody know the answer, or did you Google it? No, you're not having it, Helen. I gave you the answer. If nobody Googled it, then I'm impressed. I'll give you the answer. So what does Roy Orbison and Burt Bacharach have in common? Well, it's Siri. So she was a backup singer for both of them. And she is indeed the voice of Siri. And I thought, well, I had to bring the robotics in at the end. So I'm so glad my mobile phone is not in here because she might have started to talk to me. On that note, I'd like to say thank you for listening. I hope my insight, it is my insight. It's from my experience with different, whether it be in-house or with Bureau. I hope that you found it of use. If nothing else, you know, at least some food for thought for the future. And I wish you all very well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Karen. I really enjoyed that. And the sad thing is that I can remember Burt Bacharach when it first came out, when he first issued his music, not further on down the line when it's just a question on the end of here. What I would like to say is thank you all very much for joining this. I hope that if you came on to this session with some questions that you wanted answering with or some questions that you had that Karen's given you ideas for, then that would be marvelous. As she said, if you do have any follow-up questions, if you sit later on and think, I wonder how this, that or the other, either get in touch with me, because I think you've all got my email address, or get in touch with Karen on LinkedIn. But other than that, thank you all ever so much. I would like to wish you all a really good rest of the day, and hope to see you all again sometime very soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.